There's an old adage in personal relationships and building friendships and even, I guess, professional relationships, which is the best way to really make a connection with someone is to get them to start talking about themselves. And that is an adage I have lived by my entire life. It's a conscious strategy, really. When I meet someone or want to like develop a relationship, I just find ways to prompt them to share their thoughts or their experiences, to get them talking about themselves. The basis of the idea is that people love to talk about themselves. I'm not sure that's always true because I don't like talking about myself, but be that as it may, there's this really interesting way that we can take this idea and apply it, I think, very effectively in B2B sales. Why? Because B2B sales is just another example of human relations. And this came up in a podcast I did about a year ago now with the incredible Jen Allen Knuth. She was doing a podcast, hosting a podcast on storytelling, and so she invited me on, and we talked about how to apply storytelling capabilities or talents in sales conversations. And it's of course something I've been doing all my life. This whole series is kind of a series of stories and telling of stories. This being a perfect example, I suppose. But I can't help myself. I took the whole idea and spun it around 180 degrees and put it on its head. And I asked Jen. I said, what if our role in being a great seller isn't so much to be a great storyteller, but maybe actually to be a great story prompter. And this, in fact, goes back to that whole idea of human relations, get someone talking about themselves. And I've used this quite often, particularly when I don't have the experience. If I'm talking to, particularly early on in my career, I'm talking to a chief sales officer, and I've been a German professor for the last 10 years of my life. I don't have a lot of stories to share, personal experiences to share that are relevant to the person I'm talking to, but I have found, and I did find back then, that I could prompt them to share their stories based on conversations I had had with their peers or just things that I wonder out loud about. I've talked about four heads of sales in the last 3 days, and they're all kind of saying the same things. Has this ever happened to you? And that's a prompt. And I find that if you've got a really great set of prompts that are not mechanical, so give me a story of when, nobody likes that, right? It sounds like a college essay. But if you can find ways to build prompting into your talk track, into your conversation, but do it in a natural way. And I guess when I say that, I don't mean like practice it so it sounds natural, but literally be curious. You're, after all, talking to another human being. And it's just interesting to see how they see the world, to understand how their lived experience impacts their current position. We're talking to a lot of companies are moving to a recurring revenue model and moving into consumption world. And I'm talking to a lot of people, and they're finding that's actually really frustrating. How is that playing out for you? Can you give me a story of how that works for you? Um, and I think there's a fine line here, even as I do that out loud off the top of my head. It's like all these videos are off the cuff. It can sound a little forced. It can sound a little canned. So I think that's what you want to be careful of. And I think the best way to not sound canned is to legitimately mean it. But I find things like, has this ever happened to you, is a better prompt than give me a story of, which by the way is also a command, which sounds a little, I don't like using the imperative voice when I can avoid it. But there it is. Maybe a bit rambling perhaps, but nonetheless a great idea to just experiment with as you engage with your customers virtually, in person, online. Heck, you can even do this digitally. Um, but I think it's this really interesting thing of rather being a storyteller, try being a story prompter and seeing if you can find ways to get that person to open up on a human level and share an experience, an example of something that they've lived, not just something that they're, a challenge they're facing or something that's keeping them up at night, but just to get them to share a story. And when you start communicating with people at the story level rather than the sort of analytical, objective challenge level, I think you're going to find you're going to more naturally make a connection, not just you to them, but more importantly, them to you. And that's at the end of the day, kind of what it's all about.